Thank you so much, Hedy and Yusuf, for the 4 Cs in 4 Rs. Wonderful advice for all of us. My name is Pranay. Thank you so much, Dr. Chopra, for having me here and for making this talk possible. Dr. Chopra asked me to speak about storytelling in medicine. I like telling stories. My wife and I, after we have dinner dates, we like to walk home to burn off some of the calories. And we like to look at these multi-story buildings. Beautiful, that's Boston. And we like to look at the illuminated windows. And once you've had a little bit of wine, it's really entertaining to make up stories about the people within the windows. So for example, we point at an 11-story window and we say, oh, there's a guy in there from Boise, Idaho. He moved to MIT to do particle physics. He enjoys guitar music. He likes Irish step dancing. And he's really, really single. And he's got an irrational fear of the elevator. And on the 10th floor, there's this really attractive woman. She's from Chicago. She does organic chemistry at Harvard. And she loves Irish step dancing. She loves guitar music. Also very, very single, but has an irrational fear of the stairwell. And so never the twain shall meet. It's funnier when you're drunk. But But our corny little joke is that, these are multi-story buildings, but these are also multi-story buildings. And I know it's really stupid, but, go with it. So hospitals are multi-story buildings too. That's where I did my residency. And even the one-story hospitals, clinics, even one-story clinics, these are multi-story buildings. And there's a difference, though. When Anne and I make up stories about these people, there is no way for us to figure out if they are true or not, and we certainly don't get to play a role in those stories. But hospitals are different. There's something sacred about these stories. There's something important about these stories. These aren't silly little fibs. And what's more, we're not making them up. The patients are dying to tell us their stories. They want us to hear them. And we have an opportunity to do something about those stories. And the first time I really realized that was when I was an intern, and this was my first day on the hematology service at Yale. And I walk into this room to admit this guy, and he looks like General Patton. He's like really military. He's like sitting ramrod straight, and the first thing he says to me is, "Doc, what's the plan of attack?" And I was like, whoa, hang in there. Tell me a little bit about yourself. And so he tells me that he's got AML, and he's been getting a lot of fluids along with his chemotherapy. And because of that, he's got fluid overload. His feet are completely swollen. And he tells me that his goal is to walk out of the hospital on his own feet. And we said, okay, fine, we can do that for you. So every day we'd walk in, diuresing him, and every day he'd greet us with, what's the plan of attack? And we'd say, a little less water, a little bit more Lasix. And gradually, his swelling went away, and he was able to walk out of the hospital. So we were like, yes, that's a win. We won that battle. Unfortunately, within a couple of weeks, he was back. And there was something different about him this time. He looked defeated. And when I asked him what happened, his doctor had told him, his outpatient hematologist, given him a very poor prognosis. He said, you only have a couple of weeks to live. And he said it very bluntly, so he was extra dejected about it. And so as I'm admitting him, I don't know if I was too hasty, but potentially. And I sort of just brought up the idea of palliative care, of hospice. And he nodded, and I left the room. The next day when I came to pre-round on him, his wife was waiting outside, and she stops me and she says, he's not your best friend right now. And I ask, what happened? And she says, he just doesn't think you're fighting for him anymore. And as I walked away from the room, I let him alone for the time being. I just thought about this metaphor of war that we use so routinely for medicine, right? We fight infections, we battle cancer. What about those two pictures looks similar to you? How has a profession whose cornerstone is kindness and care, what does that have in common with death and devastation of war? And so I came back to his bedside for bedside rounds, and I presented him in medicalese to my attending. And he was still looking dejected. So I just turned to him, and there was something very deep within me that wanted to reach out to him. So I squatted down next to his bed and looked him in the eyes, and I just started speaking. The words just flowed out of me. And what I told him was, Louis, you're not fighting a war here. What we have here is an opportunity to co-author the final chapter of your life, to make it a chapter that your family can look back at with peace and without regret. And he nodded, and this time he nodded with conviction. And this idea of authoring his final chapter really resonated with him. Over the next couple of days, we did a family meeting, and sometimes you have to prod patients. You say, well, this is what we do when you have difficulty breathing, then we think about an intubation, we explain ACLS to them. He did that for himself. He said, Doc, what happens if this happens? What happens if I can't breathe? What happens if my heart stops? He became a really active participant in his story, and he decided ultimately that there was no role for ACLS or intubation in his life. And sure enough, within a couple of weeks, he was in the ICU, and I was called to say that he was dying. They told me he was dying. And I was there at the end. He had this massive family. They were all around his bed, and I was there with them. And I got to hold his hand as well as his breath grew shallower. There were lots of stories. They talked about the fact that he used to address thousands of people at the peak of his career. Very strong man, very great family man. And what I loved about that moment was that the focus was not on his FiO2. The focus was on the man. There were tears, but there was also laughter. There was no war. There's only peace. So that was a very meaningful moment for me, and I realized how that metaphor had changed things for him. I don't know how I came across that metaphor. I'm an amateur writer, and I guess I just reached for a writing metaphor. That was incredible. I wrote about him in the Huffington Post. And then several months went by, and I was about to go on vacation, but they called me in because of my co-residents fell sick. So I was covering a service for one day. And while on the service, I met this lovely lady. She was in her 80s. She was this British nurse who had actually lived through the Battle of Britain. So as bombs were falling on London, she was there taking care of people. She's a tough lady, and also really funny, and we kind of bonded over our accents. She told me that her husband was a doctor and was sick and was actually in the hospital, and she really wanted to see him. So after we were done with rounds that day, I wheeled her wheelchair to the ICU. And you know how we all have a clinical gestalt. We can look at a patient and kind of know how they're doing. Through the glass door of the ICU, she looked at her husband, whose face was just gaunt and wasted. And I think she knew in that moment that he wasn't going to make it. I can't even imagine what that feels like. But given her face, given her despondency, I took her back to her room. I didn't have any words for her. What do you say to a person like that? So I just printed out what I'd written about Louis, and I gave her that article. I also gave her my cell phone number and said, if you want to talk, if you want to call me, please go ahead and do that. I left the next day for vacation and came back from Sri Lanka in 2 weeks, and I found a voicemail waiting for me. It was from her. Her voice, her accent was unmistakable, and what she said to me was that she'd read my article about 50 times, which I think was an overestimation. But she said that the idea of co-authoring a chapter of her husband's life and shifting away the narrative from war is what helped her decide to send him to hospice. And he died peacefully. And it was an incredible example of how one patient's story altered another's. And it sort of reaffirmed for me the idea that it is important to pay attention to patient stories and share them. And we have a unique vantage point from which we can actually see these stories. And it matters to us too. If I had to get out of my bed every day to fight against death and disease, a fight that I was going to lose, inevitably, I wouldn't leave the bed. What gets me out is this idea of co-authoring these chapters. Whether it's the beginning, the middle, or the end, we have an option to do that every single day. And that's what really gets me out of bed. And I really saw this play out when I was a third-year resident, and I had this intern who had a reputation for being somewhat jaded. It was a busy day. We admitted patients, we discharged patients, we had family meetings, and then we were preparing to sign out the overnight team. And I see her looking at the sign-out sheet that she'd printed, and her eyes were kind of moist, and she just looked stunned. So I checked in with her. I said, "Hey, are you okay?" And she says, "I don't think I helped anyone today." I'm sure you've heard other doctors say this, and I know that that was not the first or the last time that I heard that sentence from a physician. Think about how ridiculous that is. Our profession is so consequential. Every single thing we do is in service of other people. What we do is to save lives and to make them somewhat better, to ameliorate pain. So how can you not help anyone after a busy day at work? So I took that sign-out sheet from her, and I translated from medicalese into English what she had done. So for one patient who was dying of cancer, I said, "Listen, you took this patient who's dying, you told her that they're dying, which is such a hard thing to do, and you spared her confusion and pain at the end of her life. This patient who was here with a kidney infection was just rolling around in his bed with pain from pyelonephritis. You took him, you gave him the right antibiotics, and he's feeling better now. This patient who's been stuck in the hospital for days because of insurance issues and he can't leave with the right antibiotics, you took care of that, and he can go home to his wife and children now. I would say you helped people." She nodded, she cried a little bit, but there were tears of joy, and she recognized that she had in fact done something. One way of measuring burnout is the Maslach burnout inventory. I don't like using the word burnout, I usually use moral injury. But at least two items in the two domains of the Maslach burnout inventory, I think can be actually mitigated with stories. One is depersonalization, and one is personal accomplishment. So depersonalization is when patients just fade into their diagnoses. We talk about that guy with the pancreatitis. I know for a fact that for me, if I know something about the patient, that just adds an extra oomph of motivation for me to do something for them. So if I know that this is an artist, I have so much more motivation in some ways to do something about their CMV retinitis. So I really think knowing the stories of our patients empowers us as physicians to take better care of them. And then, I'll tell you, thinking about Louis and thinking about the role I had the privilege to play in helping him die on his own terms, that made me feel so good about myself and what I do. So the personal accomplishment aspect of moral injury can also be mitigated by stories. And ultimately, I'm a scientist, so I have to have a chart in my talk. So this is how I visualize my day. There's some bad things that happen. You have some sexist or racist patient say something mean to you. Or you get slammed with 10 admissions, and this is the 100th day in a row that that's happened because your hospital is chronically understaffed. Alternatively, you have kind of a slightly annoying experience where the peer-to-peer guide, gives you grief about an MRI that you know is indicated. Or you have a difficult discussion with a family that doesn't quite get how sick their family member is. Or you have an awesome thing that happens to you. You run a rapid response and you save a life, or you get somebody off opiates with Suboxone. Those are wins, unqualified wins. This is what our day actually looks like. We have a lot of good things happen to us and a lot of bad things that happen to us, and a lot of things in the middle. Now, if you're a psychotically optimistic person, you're going to pick those stories to make your narrative. Right, because a story is just a subunit of a narrative. So the stories that we select for our daily narrative, are really, really crucial. So if you're crazy, and I do not recommend this, although some pop psychology people do, you can make that your point estimate of your day, but there's a problem with that because then you're ignoring the bad stuff and that's going to catch up with you. Now, if you're a Debbie Downer or Danny Downer, you're going to pick that. And that sucks too because you're actually ignoring all the good stuff, the little and the big. And honestly, it is easy for us to do this because when we sit down in the cafeteria and talk to each other, we vent, and we tend to bring up the worst parts of our day. We don't tend to sort of focus on the good stuff. So really, I think, if you think about it, this should be our ideal, that we account for all of these stories and come up with a point estimate of our day that's more rational. So every day, we really do have the chance to make our narrative. And I think attuning ourselves to the joys in the space between the moments that go by so quickly is the way to sort of perhaps gain a little bit more resiliency in our work. And this is the importance of stories in our profession. And so I just want to acknowledge the credits, and I want to just thank my wife, who makes it so easy for me to be joyful. And special thanks to these people, Dr. Chopra, Frank Domino, and Jill Grimes, without whom I wouldn't be on the stage today. And taking advice from Hedy, I actually processed a lot of the difficulties I had in residency into stories. I wrote every day, and I put some of those stories into this book with this theme of finding joy in medicine. And with that, I thank you, and I hope you all go and find joy. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. That was awesome.